At exactly 8:15 and 17 seconds in the morning, on August 6, 1945, a single bomb fell from the sky over Hiroshima, Japan. In 1/10 of a millionth of a second, the temperature at the hypocenter reached several million degrees Celsius. The light generated was so intense that it permanently burned shadows of human beings onto concrete walls. The blast wave traveled faster than the speed of sound, flattening everything within a mile radius. 70,000 people died instantly. By December, that number would reach 140,000. The atomic age had arrived, and humanity would never be the same. This is the story of the day that changed warfare, politics, ethics, and human consciousness forever. The city that awoke that August morning was Japan's seventh largest, home to approximately 350,000 people. Hiroshima sat on the delta of the Ota River, which branched into 7 channels as it flowed into the inland sea, creating a city of islands connected by 81 bridges. The rivers and flat terrain made it an ideal location for commerce and industry, but more importantly for military planners, Hiroshima was a major military center. The 2nd General Army Headquarters was based there, charged with defending all of southern Japan. The city housed significant military supply depots, embarkation facilities for troops heading to the Asian mainland, and numerous war industries manufacturing everything from rifles to ships. Yet compared to other Japanese cities, Hiroshima had been remarkably untouched by American bombing. Tokyo had been devastated by massive firebombing raids in March that killed over 100,000 people in a single night. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and dozens of other cities had suffered similar fates. By summer 1945, American B-29 Superfortress bombers flew over Japan with virtual impunity, dropping incendiary bombs that created firestorms in the wooden cities below. But Hiroshima remained largely intact. The city had experienced only a few small raids, nothing like the wholesale destruction visited upon other urban centers. Some residents whispered that perhaps the Americans were sparing Hiroshima because it was so beautiful, or because many Japanese Americans had emigrated from this region. The truth was far more sinister. American planners were preserving Hiroshima specifically so they could measure the full destructive power of their new weapon on an undamaged target. The weapon that would destroy Hiroshima had its origins in the theoretical physics of the 1930s. When German scientists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann split the uranium atom in 1938, physicists around the world immediately recognized the implications. If uranium atoms could be split, releasing enormous amounts of energy in the process, and if those split atoms could trigger a chain reaction splitting more atoms, the result would be an explosion of unprecedented power. Many of the scientists who understood these implications were Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. They watched with horror as Hitler's armies conquered Europe, and they feared that German scientists might develop an atomic bomb first. In August 1939, just weeks before Germany invaded Poland and started World War II, Albert Einstein signed a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt warning that Nazi Germany might be developing atomic weapons and urging the United States to begin its own research program. Roosevelt authorized preliminary research, but it wasn't until after Pearl Harbor in December 1941 that the effort became a national priority. In August 1942, the United States Army Corps of Engineers established the Manhattan Engineer District, soon simply called the Manhattan Project, to develop an atomic bomb before Germany could. The Manhattan Project became the largest secret scientific and industrial undertaking in history. At its peak, it employed over 130,000 people at sites across the United States and Canada, with a budget that eventually reached $2 billion, equivalent to roughly $30 billion in today's currency. The project required multiple parallel efforts because nobody knew which approach would work. Some scientists worked on enriching uranium-235, the rare isotope needed for one type of bomb. Others worked on producing plutonium-239, a synthetic element that didn't exist in nature but could also sustain a chain reaction. Massive industrial facilities were built in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington, to produce these materials. Meanwhile, at a secret laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico, a team of brilliant physicists led by J. Robert Oppenheimer worked on designing the actual weapons. Oppenheimer was a complex figure, a theoretical physicist with remarkably broad interests in literature, philosophy, and Eastern religions. He had studied Sanskrit and could quote the Bhagavad Gita from memory. His students at Berkeley idolized him, and his colleagues recognized his unique ability to understand and synthesize ideas across different fields of physics. He was also politically left-leaning, with past associations with communist organizations, which made him a security risk in the eyes of military intelligence. But General Leslie Groves, the hard-driving Army engineer who directed the Manhattan Project, recognized that Oppenheimer possessed the intellectual brilliance and leadership skills needed to coordinate the diverse team of scientists at Los Alamos. Groves pushed through Oppenheimer's security clearance, and the physicist proved to be an inspired choice, driving the project forward with relentless energy. By spring 1945, the scientists at Los Alamos had designed two different types of atomic bombs. The uranium bomb, called Little Boy, used a gun-type design where one piece of uranium-235 would be fired down a barrel into another piece, creating a critical mass that would sustain a chain reaction. This design was so simple and reliable that the scientists didn't believe it needed testing. The plutonium bomb, called Fat Man, used a more complex implosion design where conventional explosives arranged around a plutonium core would detonate simultaneously, compressing the plutonium to critical density. This design was so complex and uncertain that it absolutely required testing. The test took place on July 16, 1945, at a site in the New Mexico desert called Trinity. The scientists didn't know if the bomb would work at all or if it might work too well. Some had speculated that an atomic explosion might ignite the nitrogen in Earth's atmosphere, creating a chain reaction that would destroy all life on the planet. Most physicists dismissed this possibility, but nobody could be absolutely certain until they tried. At 5:29 in the morning, the device detonated. The flash was visible over 200 miles away. A massive fireball rose into the sky, followed by a mushroom cloud that eventually reached over 7 miles high. The steel tower supporting the bomb vaporized instantly. Sand around ground zero fused into radioactive green glass. The shock wave was felt over 100 miles away. Oppenheimer, watching from a control bunker 10 miles away, later recalled that a line from the Bhagavad Gita flashed through his mind, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Other scientists had different reactions. Some cheered at the success of their work. Some felt sick at what they had created. Enrico Fermi, the Italian physicist who had built the first nuclear reactor in Chicago, calmly dropped pieces of paper to measure the blast wave and calculate the bomb's yield. The explosion released energy equivalent to about 20,000 tons of TNT, far exceeding most predictions. The atomic age had begun, though only a handful of people in the world knew it yet. President Roosevelt had died in April 1945, and his successor Harry Truman learned about the Manhattan Project only after becoming president. Truman was in Potsdam, Germany for a conference with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin when news of the Trinity test arrived. The telegram simply read, "Baby satisfactorily born," but Truman understood the implications. He now possessed a weapon that might end the war with Japan without the need for an invasion that military planners estimated could cost 500,000 American casualties. The strategic situation in August 1945 was complex and brutal. Germany had surrendered in May, but Japan fought on despite having lost virtually all its conquests. American forces had captured Iwo Jima and Okinawa in battles of extraordinary savagery, where Japanese soldiers fought almost to the last man and thousands of civilians committed suicide rather than surrender. American bombers had burned dozens of Japanese cities to ashes. American submarines had strangled Japanese shipping, cutting the island nation off from resources. The Soviet Union was preparing to enter the war against Japan, potentially opening a new front. But Japan's military leadership refused to surrender unconditionally, clinging to hopes that they might negotiate terms that would preserve the imperial system and avoid occupation. The Americans had broken Japanese diplomatic codes and knew that some Japanese officials were seeking peace through intermediaries, but these same intercepts showed that Japan's military leadership was preparing for a final defense of the home islands. Millions of civilians were being trained to resist invasion with bamboo spears. thousands of aircraft were being held in reserve for kamikaze attacks on invasion fleets. Military planners estimated that invading Japan would take over a year and cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties, plus millions of Japanese military and civilian deaths. The experience of Okinawa, where 1/4 of the civilian population died, suggested that an invasion of Japan would be catastrophic for everyone involved. Truman and his advisors faced an agonizing decision. They could continue the conventional bombing campaign and naval blockade, hoping that Japan would eventually surrender, but this approach was already killing thousands daily and showed no sign of forcing capitulation. They could wait for Soviet entry into the war, but nobody knew if that would convince Japan's leaders to surrender, and allowing the Soviets a major role in Japan's defeat might complicate post-war arrangements. They could modify the demand for unconditional surrender to guarantee preservation of the emperor, which might make surrender more palatable to Japan, but this would be politically difficult at home after 4 years of wartime propaganda portraying the Japanese as fanatics who deserved no mercy. Or they could use the atomic bomb, demonstrating its terrible power and shocking Japan's leaders into surrender. Some scientists who had worked on the bomb opposed its use against cities. A group led by physicist James Franck prepared a report arguing that the bomb should be demonstrated on an uninhabited island, allowing Japanese leaders to see its power without the mass casualties of an attack on a city. But this proposal faced practical and strategic objections. What if the demonstration bomb failed to detonate properly? America had only 2 bombs immediately available, with more taking months to produce. A failed demonstration would be a propaganda disaster. Even if the bomb worked perfectly, would Japanese leaders surrender based on a demonstration, or would they dismiss it as a trick or convince themselves that America had only 1 bomb? And fundamentally, after 4 years of brutal war, after Pearl Harbor, after the Bataan Death March, after kamikaze attacks, after the fanatical resistance on Saipan and Okinawa where Japanese soldiers and civilians chose death over surrender, American leaders felt little inclination to show mercy or conduct demonstrations for the enemy's benefit. On July 25, 1945, Truman approved orders for atomic weapons to be used against Japan as soon as weather permitted after August 3rd. The orders specified that the targets would be selected from a list that included Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, and Nagasaki. These cities were chosen because they were militarily significant, large enough that the bomb's effects could be properly assessed, and had suffered minimal damage from conventional bombing, so the atomic bomb's effects wouldn't be confused with previous damage. The mission would be carried out by the 509th Composite Group, a special unit of the Army Air Forces created specifically for atomic bombing missions. The 509th was commanded by Colonel Paul Tibbets, a highly experienced pilot who had flown combat missions in Europe and North Africa. Tibbets handpicked his crews and trained them in complete secrecy for months. The crews practiced high-altitude precision bombing runs where they would release a single bomb and then execute a sharp 155-degree turn to escape the blast effects. They were told only that they were training for a special weapon of enormous power. Security around the 509th was so tight that even after they deployed to Tinian Island in the Marianas in May 1945, most personnel didn't know what their actual mission would be. Tinian had been captured from the Japanese in July 1944 and transformed into the largest airbase in the world. The island's flat terrain allowed construction of multiple parallel runways capable of handling the heaviest bombers. By 1945, hundreds of B-29 superfortresses operated from Tinian, flying daily missions against Japan. The 509th occupied a separate compound, isolated from other units, conducting mysterious training flights that carried single oddly shaped bombs. Other crews called them names and accused them of not pulling their weight in the bombing campaign. The 509th crews endured the harassment in silence, knowing they were preparing for something unprecedented. The 2 atomic bombs were shipped to Tinian in separate shipments. The uranium-235 for Little Boy traveled aboard the cruiser USS Indianapolis, which delivered it to Tinian on July 26th before departing on another mission. Days later, Indianapolis was sunk by a Japanese submarine, and of the 1,196 men aboard, only 316 survived after days in shark-infested waters. The plutonium core for Fat Man arrived by air. Assembly of Little Boy began immediately in an air-conditioned building under heavy guard. The bomb was 10 feet long and weighed about 9,700 pounds. It was painted a dark gray and had a nose section that contained the uranium target and a tail section that contained the uranium projectile that would be fired into the target. Inside were sophisticated electronics to control the detonation sequence, but fundamentally it was a gun that fired one piece of uranium into another. On August 4th, General Carl Spaatz, commander of the United States Strategic Air Forces in the Pacific, received formal orders to deliver the first atomic bomb as soon as weather permitted after August 3rd. Weather forecasts predicted that August 6th would have clear skies over the target cities. Tibbets selected Hiroshima as the primary target, with Kokura and Nagasaki as alternates, in case Hiroshima was obscured by clouds. He chose Hiroshima partly because it had the most favorable topography, a flat city in a river delta surrounded by hills that would reflect and focus the blast, maximizing damage. On the afternoon of August 5th, Little Boy was loaded into a B-29 that Tibbets had named Enola Gay, after his mother. 3 other B-29 seconds would accompany the mission, one carrying scientific instruments to measure the blast, one carrying cameras and observers, and one serving as backup in case Enola Gay developed mechanical problems. 7 B-29 seconds would fly ahead as weather scouts, checking conditions over the primary and alternate targets. The mission was scheduled to take off just after midnight and reach Hiroshima at approximately 8:15 in the morning, a time when many people would be outside, maximizing casualties. This brutal calculus reflected the mission's purpose, not just to destroy a city, but to shock Japan's leaders into surrender by demonstrating atomic weapons' terrible power. Tibbets assembled his crew at 11 p.m. on August 5th for a final briefing. Navy Captain William Parsons, the weaponeer who would arm the bomb in flight, explained what they would be carrying. The revelation that they would be dropping an atomic bomb capable of destroying an entire city left the crew stunned, but also proud to be chosen for such a historic mission. At midnight, Tibbets and his crew climbed aboard Enola Gay. At 2:45 a.m. on August 6th, the bomber began rolling down Tinian's Northfield runway, struggling under the weight of Little Boy and extra fuel for the mission. The takeoff was tense. A crash with an armed atomic bomb aboard could devastate the entire island. But Enola Gay lifted off smoothly and climbed into the darkness. As the bomber headed north toward Japan, Parsons and his assistant crawled into the cramped bomb bay to arm Little Boy. The bomb had been loaded unarmed because there had been too many B-29 crashes during takeoff recently, and nobody wanted an atomic weapon detonating on Tinian if Enola Gay crashed. Working by flashlight in the dark bomb bay, Parsons removed the bomb's rear plate and inserted the explosive charges that would fire the uranium projectile. It took 15 minutes to complete the arming procedure. Little Boy was now live, capable of destroying a city. The flight to Japan took 6 hours. The crew ate breakfast, relieved themselves into tubes that vented overboard, and tried to rest while Enola Gay droned northward at 31,000 feet. Tibbets kept the crew informed of their progress, maintaining the calm professional atmosphere that had made him such an effective commander. Around 7 a.m., weather scout planes radioed back their reports. Hiroshima had clear skies. The mission would proceed as planned. Below Enola Gay, Hiroshima was beginning another day of wartime routine. The city had been on alert earlier that morning when American B-29s appeared on radar, but the planes had been the weather scouts, and they flew over without dropping bombs. At 7:31 a.m., the all-clear sounded. Commuters continued to work, children walked to school, soldiers conducted morning training exercises. Streetcars rumbled through the city. Breakfast cooking fires sent smoke rising from thousands of houses. It was a hot, humid summer morning with clear skies. Perfect weather for the atomic bombing that was minutes away. At 8:09 a.m., Enola Gay's radio operator received word that Hiroshima still had clear skies. Tibbets announced to his crew that they would attack the primary target. He began the bomb run, flying straight and level at 31,000 feet and 300 miles per hour. The bombardier, Major Thomas Farabee, took control of the aircraft through his Norden bomb sight, one of the most sophisticated pieces of technology in the American arsenal, capable of dropping bombs with remarkable accuracy from high altitude. Farabee identified his aiming point, the AOA Bridge, a distinctive T-shaped bridge in the center of the city where the Ota River branched. The bridge's unique shape made it easy to identify from 6 miles up. At 8:15 a.m. and 17 seconds, little boy fell from Enola Gay's bomb bay. The weapon weighed 4 tons and would fall for 43 seconds before detonating. Tibbets immediately threw Enola Gay into the sharp diving turn they had practiced hundreds of times, banking the aircraft 155 degrees, and diving to gain speed and distance from the coming explosion. The 2 escort aircraft executed similar maneuvers. The crews put on special dark goggles to protect their eyes from the flash they had been warned would be brighter than the sun. Little boy fell nose first toward Hiroshima. Inside the bomb, barometric pressure sensors measured altitude. At approximately 1,900 feet above the ground, the detonation sequence triggered. Electrical signals fired the explosive charges that drove the uranium projectile down the barrel toward the target uranium. The 2 masses of uranium-235 came together, achieving critical mass. In 1/10 of a millionth of a second, the chain reaction was complete. The uranium atoms split, releasing neutrons that split more atoms in an exponential cascade that released the energy locked inside the atomic nucleus. Einstein's famous equation E equal to mc2 described what happened. A tiny amount of matter, approximately 1 gram of uranium, converted directly into pure energy. The temperature at the hypocenter reached several million degrees Celsius, hotter than the surface of the sun. A fireball 300 meters in diameter formed, instantly vaporizing everything within a kilometer. Human beings near ground zero were literally atomized, their bodies converted to gas and plasma before they could even perceive what was happening. Buildings, trees, vehicles, animals, all simply ceased to exist. Slightly further from the hypocenter, the thermal radiation was intense enough to melt stone and metal. Roof tiles melted and bubbled. Bronze statues liquefied. Iron structural supports softened and bent like candles. The thermal pulse reached ground level in a fraction of a second, traveling at the speed of light. People outside within 2 kilometers of ground zero suffered severe burns on exposed skin. The thermal radiation was so intense that it burned patterns of clothing into people's skin. White clothing reflected some radiation while dark patterns absorbed it, creating grotesque images of kimonos permanently seared into human flesh. Shadows were burned into walls and pavement where objects or people blocked the thermal radiation, leaving permanent silhouettes. One famous shadow showed a person who had been sitting on stone steps. The person vaporized instantly, but their shadow remained, a haunting outline that can still be seen today. 1 second after detonation, the fireball began rising, superheated gases expanding upward at hundreds of miles per hour. The mushroom cloud that would become the iconic symbol of atomic weapons was forming, though nobody on the ground could see it yet. The blast wave followed close behind the thermal pulse and wall of compressed air radiating outward at supersonic speed. When it reached the ground, it created winds of over 700 miles per hour at the hypocenter, diminishing to hurricane-force winds several kilometers away. Buildings near ground zero were crushed flat, as if stepped on by a giant. The Shima Hospital, which was almost directly beneath the explosion, was driven straight down into its foundation, the upper floors pancaking onto the lower floors until the building was reduced to a pile of rubble barely higher than a single story. The distinctive dome of the Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall, about 160 meters from ground zero, had its roof and interior blasted away, but some of the walls remained standing. This building would be preserved after the war as the atomic bomb dome, the most famous surviving structure from the bombing. The blast wave spread outward in a perfect circle, flattening everything in its path. Wooden buildings disintegrated. Brick and concrete structures had their walls blown out. The overpressure was so intense that it burst internal organs of people caught in the open. The blast created a vacuum behind it, and a reverse wind rushed back toward the hypocenter, further damaging structures and creating a firestorm as overturned braziers and cooking fires ignited the wooden debris now scattered across the city. People's experiences of the bombing varied drastically depending on where they were and what they were doing at 8:15 a.m. Those outside within a kilometer of ground zero and not shielded by substantial structures were killed instantly by the thermal pulse and blast wave. Those inside buildings, or behind protective structures, might survive the initial effects, but found themselves trapped in collapsed buildings, buried under rubble, often badly burned or injured. Those further from ground zero experienced the bombing as a sequence of distinct events. First the flash, brighter than anything they had ever seen. Then the heat, burning exposed skin. Then the blast wave, sometimes seconds later, smashing windows and collapsing buildings. Then the strange winds and the rising mushroom cloud that dominated the sky. Akiko Takakura was a 20-year-old bank employee working in the Hiroshima Bank building about 300 meters from ground zero. The thick concrete building saved her life. Though she was badly burned and injured, she remembered seeing the flash through the window, feeling intense heat, and then being thrown across the room as the building shook. When she regained consciousness, the building was dark and filled with dust. She heard people screaming and crying but couldn't see anything. Eventually, she made her way outside and saw a landscape that looked like the end of the world. Eizo Nomura was a postal worker about 2,400 meters from ground zero when the bomb exploded. He saw the flash, felt intense heat on his face, and threw himself flat on the ground. The blast wave passed over him, and when he stood up, he saw an enormous mushroom cloud rising over the city. Buildings around him had collapsed. People were stumbling through the streets, badly burned, their clothes in tatters, skin hanging from their bodies in sheets. Many walked with their arms held out in front of them to prevent their burned skin from touching their bodies. They moved like sleepwalkers, in shock, unable to process what had happened. Aboard Enola Gay, the crew felt the shockwave reach their aircraft, 53 seconds after releasing the bomb. The plane jumped and rattled despite being over 11 miles away. Tibbets looked back and saw the mushroom cloud boiling up toward them, a massive column of smoke and debris that would eventually reach over 40,000 feet. CO pilot Robert Lewis wrote in his log, "My God, what have we done?" Tail gunner Bob Caron described the city as covered by what looked like a pot of boiling tar. Tibbets radioed a simple message, results clear-cut, successful in all respects. The crew photographed the mushroom cloud, took measurements of radiation levels, and turned toward Tinian, their mission complete. In Hiroshima, survivors faced an apocalyptic landscape. Fires were breaking out across the city as overturned cooking braziers ignited wooden debris. The firestorm would eventually consume much of what the blast hadn't destroyed. The rivers were filling with people seeking relief from their burns and from the fires. Thousands would drown or die in the water. People wandered through streets that no longer existed, trying to find family members, trying to reach hospitals that had been destroyed, trying to make sense of what had happened. The medical situation was catastrophic beyond comprehension. Hiroshima had about 300 doctors before the bombing. Over 270 of them were killed instantly or died shortly after because they lived and worked in the central districts that were completely destroyed. Of the city's 45 hospitals, 42 were in the destroyed zone. Most nurses were killed. Most medical supplies were destroyed or inaccessible. The surviving doctors and nurses, many badly injured themselves, faced thousands of casualties with burns, blast injuries, crush injuries, and radiation exposure, with no functioning hospitals, almost no supplies, and no way to understand or treat the radiation sickness that would begin appearing within days. Dr. Michihiko Hachiya was director of the Hiroshima Communications Hospital, about a mile from ground zero. The building partially collapsed, and Hachiya was badly injured, but he and some staff managed to set up a makeshift aid station. He would later write a detailed diary describing the weeks after the bombing. His entries from the first day described the horror, thousands of badly burned people flooding the hospital, people with glass shards embedded in their bodies, people with horrific blast injuries, the smell of burned flesh everywhere, and the complete inability to help more than a tiny fraction of the injured. Medical staff worked without rest, without supplies, doing what little they could, while casualties kept arriving faster than they could be treated. The burns were unlike anything the doctors had seen before. Thermal radiation burns didn't just damage the surface skin, they penetrated deeply, causing damage that conventional medical treatment couldn't address. People with relatively minor-looking burns would die within days as their injuries became infected or their internal organs failed. The blast injuries were massive and varied, people crushed by collapsed buildings, impaled by flying debris, with limbs torn off by the overpressure. Many casualties had combinations of burns, blast trauma, and severe cuts from shattered glass that had been driven into their bodies like shrapnel. And then there was the mysterious illness that began appearing within days, radiation sickness. People who seemed to have survived with minor injuries suddenly became ill with strange symptoms: nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, fever, hair loss, bleeding from gums and internal organs, infections that wouldn't heal. Japanese doctors didn't understand what they were seeing. Some thought it might be an epidemic disease released by the bomb. Others theorized that the bomb had released poison gas. The concept of radiation sickness was not widely understood, even among medical professionals, as people began dying with these strange symptoms. Often after initially seeming to recover from their immediate injuries, fear and confusion spread. The Japanese government's initial response was hampered by the complete breakdown of communications from Hiroshima. The city had essentially ceased to exist as a functioning entity in seconds. Telegraph lines were down, phone connections were severed, radio stations were off the air, military units in the city were destroyed or scattered. For hours, Tokyo knew only that something catastrophic had happened in Hiroshima, but had no details. Reports that did arrive were confusing and contradictory. How could a single bomb destroy an entire city? Japanese officials suspected the reports were exaggerated, or that Hiroshima had been hit by a massive conventional bombing raid. By midday on August 6th, reconnaissance planes flying over Hiroshima radioed reports describing a city covered in smoke, with massive fires burning. That evening, a military staff officer who had been in Tokyo visiting from Hiroshima managed to return to the city and sent reports describing total destruction. But still, the idea that one bomb could cause such devastation seemed impossible. Japanese scientists were consulted. Some began to suspect that an atomic bomb might have been used, but the idea seemed fantastic. Japan's own atomic weapons research program, which had been underway since 1941, had concluded that building an atomic bomb would require resources far beyond Japan's capabilities, and scientists assumed America would face similar constraints. President Truman issued a statement 16 hours after the bombing informing the world that America had used an atomic bomb against Hiroshima. He described it as a harnessing of the basic power of the universe, and warned Japan that if they did not surrender, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. The statement explained that the Manhattan Project had cost $2 billion and employed thousands of workers at multiple sites. It was a declaration that America had won the race to develop atomic weapons and possessed the power to destroy Japanese cities one by one if necessary. The reaction around the world was a mixture of awe, horror, and relief. In America, many celebrated the new weapon as a way to end the war quickly and save American lives. Newspapers ran headlines like "Atom Bomb Hits Japan" and described the technical achievement in glowing terms. But some commentators and religious leaders immediately questioned the morality of using such a devastating weapon against a civilian city. Around the world, scientists who understood what an atomic bomb represented felt dread at the implications. Einstein, whose equation had described the possibility of converting matter to energy, would later say that if he had known Germany would not succeed in building atomic weapons, he would never have signed the letter that initiated the Manhattan Project. In Japan, the military leadership struggled to process the implications. Some argued that America couldn't have many atomic bombs, and that Japan should continue fighting. Others recognized that a weapon capable of destroying a city with a single bomb fundamentally changed the strategic situation. The Soviet Union's declaration of war on Japan on August 8th, launching a massive invasion of Japanese-occupied Manchuria, added to the pressure. Japan now faced enemies on all fronts with no hope of victory, but the military leadership still resisted unconditional surrender. The people of Hiroshima lived through the days after the bombing in a state of shock and desperate struggle for survival. The city had become a wasteland of rubble and ash. Fires continued burning for days. Bodies were everywhere, decomposing in the summer heat. Survivors with radiation sickness began dying in increasing numbers. The death toll climbed daily as people who had seemed to survive succumbed to their injuries or illness. Yoshito Matsushige was a photographer for the Chugoku Shimbun newspaper who survived the bombing about 2 kilometers from ground zero. He grabbed his camera and spent the day walking through the destroyed city, but he found the scene so horrible that he could only bring himself to take 5 photographs, and 3 of those turned out too dark to print. One of his photographs shows burned and wounded people receiving first aid at a makeshift station. The other shows police officers attending to injured civilians near a destroyed bridge. These images, along with a handful of others taken by other survivors, provided the first visual documentation of atomic bombing's effects. The American military continued planning follow-up attacks. A second atomic bomb, the plutonium implosion weapon called Fat Man, was being prepared on Tinian for use as soon as possible. The original plan called for using the second bomb on August 11th, but weather forecasts suggested that August 9th might be the last day with acceptable weather for several days. The decision was made to attack on August 9th. The primary target was Kokura, with Nagasaki as the secondary target. On the morning of August 9th, a B-29 named Boxcar took off from Tinian carrying Fat Man. The mission ran into problems from the start. A fuel pump malfunction meant the bomber couldn't use 600 gallons of fuel. Weather over Kokura was hazy, and the bombardier couldn't identify the aiming point clearly. After 3 unsuccessful bomb runs over Kokura, with fuel running low and Japanese fighters being scrambled to intercept them, the crew diverted to the secondary target, Nagasaki. Nagasaki was also obscured by clouds, and fuel was now critically low. The bombardier was preparing to drop Fat Man by radar, which would be less accurate, when a break in the clouds appeared. He quickly identified a stadium and dropped the bomb. Fat Man detonated at 11:02 a.m. local time, approximately 1,650 feet above ground. The yield was about 21 kilotons, more powerful than Little Boy, but Nagasaki's hilly terrain meant that the destruction was more localized than in Hiroshima. Nevertheless, approximately 40,000 people were killed immediately, with the death toll eventually reaching about 80,000. The second atomic bombing, coming just 3 days after Hiroshima, shattered any remaining Japanese hopes that America possessed only one atomic bomb. Combined with the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, the 2 atomic bombings created an impossible military situation. On August 10th, Japan's government sent word through neutral Switzerland that it would accept the Potsdam Declaration demanding unconditional surrender, provided the emperor's position was preserved. After some diplomatic back and forth clarifying that the emperor would be subject to the Allied Supreme Commander, Japan formally surrendered on August 15th. The surrender was announced by Emperor Hirohito in a radio broadcast, the first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard their emperor's voice. World War II ended, but for the people of Hiroshima, the suffering continued. In the weeks and months following the bombing, radiation sickness killed thousands who had survived the initial blast and thermal effects. Hair fell out in clumps. Purple spots appeared on skin from bleeding under the surface. People bled from their gums, noses, and rectums. White blood cell counts plummeted, leaving people unable to fight infections. Many died of illnesses that healthy people would easily survive. Pregnant women suffered miscarriages at extremely high rates. Cancer rates among survivors would be elevated for decades. The city itself was a wasteland. Approximately 69% of Hiroshima's buildings were destroyed completely, with another 7% severely damaged. The center of the city was essentially flat, with only a few reinforced concrete buildings still standing, and those were burned-out shells. Bodies lay everywhere, and the scale of death made proper burial impossible. Mass cremations were conducted using whatever wood could be gathered. Rivers were clogged with bodies. American occupation forces arrived in Japan in late August and immediately restricted access to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Military censorship prevented Japanese media from publishing photographs or detailed reports about the atomic bombing's effects. American officials wanted to control the narrative about atomic weapons and prevent images that might generate sympathy for Japan or opposition to America's use of nuclear weapons. This censorship would continue until the occupation ended in 1952. American scientists and medical personnel did conduct extensive studies of the atomic bombing's effects. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission was established in 1947 to study the long-term health effects on survivors. These studies would continue for decades, providing crucial data about radiation's effects on human health, but also raising ethical questions about studying people without offering treatment. Survivors felt they were being treated as research subjects rather than patients deserving care. The immediate death toll from the Hiroshima bombing was approximately 70,000 people, though exact figures are impossible to determine because family records